It is 40 degrees below zero. At this temperature, the air is no longer just a gas. It is a physical weight pressing down on your chest. A single deep breath can burn your lungs. In the frozen forests of the Northeast, winter is not a season. It is an executioner. And yet, inside a structure made of nothing but bark and bent saplings, a child is walking barefoot, and the child is laughing. Hundreds of people are gathered there, sharing a hot meal, while a blizzard screams just inches above their heads. They have no metal stove, no electricity, no modern insulation of any kind. So how did the Haudenosaunee build a machine out of wood that could defy the laws of nature? How did they keep 10 fires burning in a windowless hall without suffocating everyone inside? And why did this humble survival shelter become the secret blueprint for one of the most powerful democracies the world has ever known? This is the story of the Longhouse, a masterpiece of ancient engineering, a house that breathed along with the people inside it. So imagine for a moment that you are that child, barefoot, warm, laughing in the heart of a killing winter. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why you are warm and why you will never, ever be alone. Long before the first snowflake touched the ground, survival began with a journey deep into the forest. But the people did not seek out the giants of the woods, not the ancient oaks, not the massive maples. Those trees were too proud, too rigid. Instead, they searched for the young ones, the slender saplings that still knew how to bend. They looked for hickory and cedar, no thicker than a person's wrist, but tall and straight as an arrow. And the timing was everything. By harvesting in late spring, when the sap was rising, the builders caught the wood at its most flexible. The wood was not a dead weight. It was a coiled spring, full of hidden energy. They peeled away the green bark, revealing the pale, gleaming wood beneath, cool and damp to the touch, smelling of fresh earth and rising life. Then came the dangerous, beautiful work of raising it. 2 rows of posts were driven deep into the dark soil, facing one another. Men climbed the scaffolding, muscles straining, and pulled the tops toward each other. It was a slow dance, and a deadly one. If a pole was too dry, it would snap with the sound of a breaking bone. If the pull was too sudden, it would whip back with lethal force. But when the tension was right, the wood began to groan and give, bending across the central aisle until the 2 ends met and were lashed together with long, wet strips of inner bark that would shrink and harden like iron as they dried. And when it was finished, the frame stood like the ribs of a great whale lying on the forest floor, a structure built not to resist the wind, but to sway with it. This was the first lesson of the Haudenosaunee. To survive the storm, you must learn to bend. But a skeleton is not yet a home. The whale of wood still needed its skin. Spring was the only time the trees would surrender their protection, so the people sought out the great elms with their thick, rough, waterproof bark. They did not kill the tree. Instead, with precise, rhythmic cuts, they peeled away enormous sheets, each one as tall as a person. The bark was heavy and damp, and it smelled of deep soil and ancient rain. To the Haudenosaunee, this was no mere building material. It was the tanned hide of the earth itself. The sheets were pressed flat beneath heavy stones, so they would not curl as they dried. Then they were hung and tied to the frame in overlapping layers, starting from the bottom and working up. It was exactly like the scales of a fish or the shingles of a modern roof. Every seam was placed so that rain and melting snow would slide harmlessly down the sides, never finding a way to touch the families within. And to lock it all in place, they added a second layer of poles on the outside, sandwiching the bark between 2 wooden frames. This created a structure that was both incredibly light and astonishingly strong. This was not a house that merely sat upon the land. It was a part of the land, a living shield that turned the fury of winter into a distant whisper. Inside this 300-foot tunnel of bark, it was pitch dark. until the fires were lit, and 10 open fires in a sealed hall should have killed every soul inside. A single fire could never warm a tunnel 300 feet long. So the Haudenosaunee did something smarter. They distributed the warmth. More than 10 fire pits were dug into the packed clay of the central aisle, and each one was shared by 2 families living directly across from one another. That shared fire was the very rhythm of the house. The wood was always dry and seasoned, hickory and oak, burning with a steady, powerful heat and almost no sparks. And then came the paradox of the smoke. In a house with no windows and a roof sealed tight against the rain, 10 fires should have been a death sentence. But the builders had foreseen this. Directly above each fire, a rectangular hole was cut into the roof. Outside, men used long poles to angle great flaps of bark, tilting them to catch the wind. If the wind blew from the north, the northern flap was lowered and the southern one raised, creating a gentle vacuum that pulled the smoke up and out while keeping the snow from falling in. But here is the genius. Not all of the smoke was meant to escape. Because the roof was a high, curving arch, a thick layer of gray smoke gathered in the upper third of the house, hovering about 2 meters above the floor, and that layer of smoke worked as a thermal blanket. It was a dense, warm cushion of air that trapped the rising heat of the fires and reflected it back down toward the people. To walk through the Longhouse was to pass through 2 different worlds. At eye level, the air was fresh and warm, but lift your hand above your head and it vanished into a warm, pungent gray cloud. And that same smoke did something else entirely. It was feeding them, hanging from the rafters. Deep inside that gray layer of smoke were thousands of braids of colorful corn, sacks of beans, and strips of venison. The smoke dried the food and gave it a bitter coating, keeping insects and rodents from stealing the winter stores. The Longhouse was not only a home, it was a giant, inhabited smokehouse. But the floor was the territory of the cold. Even with the fires blazing, the damp chill of the frozen ground crept upward, biting at the ankles of anyone who stood still too long. So the Haudenosaunee lived their lives on platforms. Along both walls, running the entire length of the building, were wide wooden benches, raised more than a foot off the ground. These platforms were the whole world of a family, covered with thick mats woven from corn husks and piled high with the dense, oily furs of black bear and beaver. By sleeping up here, families escaped the cold drafts that flowed along the floor. Beneath the benches, they stacked firewood, where the heat of the nearby fires slowly dried each log, so that every piece thrown onto the flames was ready to release its full energy. And above the beds, a second shelf held the bowls, the decorated clay pots, and the soft deerskin clothing. Every inch of space had a purpose. And there was one more source of warmth, hidden in plain sight: the people themselves. A resting human body gives off around 100 watts of heat, like a small furnace. And 100 small furnaces, gathered in a sealed tunnel lined with bark, could raise the temperature by several degrees before a single log was ever added to the fire. But the deepest secret of the Longhouse was not in its walls or its fires. It was in who ruled inside them. While the men moved through the distant forests, the inside of the Longhouse was the unquestioned domain of women. This was a world built on the power of the mother's line. When a man married, he left his own mother's fire and moved into his wife's house. He was a respected guest, a provider, and a protector. But the bark walls themselves belonged to the women. At the head of this great wooden hall sat the clan mother. She was the eldest, the one whose memory held the stories of 1,000 winters. Her authority was never shown through a loud voice or boasting. It was felt in the way she distributed the food and the way she tended the fire. In the dim light of a midwinter afternoon, you would find her seated on a bench, her hands busy with a needle of bone, stitching a pair of soft leather moccasins. Around her, the other women worked in a synchronized rhythm, pounding dried corn into flour in heavy wooden mortars. The steady thud of the pestle was the heartbeat of the house, and the clan mother was the keeper of the peace. In a space where 20 families shared a single hall, conflict was inevitable. But the architecture of the Longhouse demanded cooperation. You could not have a private fire. You had to share it. You could not have a private wall. You had to share it. If a dispute broke out, it was the clan mother who settled it, her voice calm and steady above the crackle of the flames, and she held the highest political power of all. It was the clan mothers who chose the men who would represent the people in the Great Council, and if a chief became selfish or warlike, the women could strip him of his title. Think of that, centuries before the modern world would even begin to speak of equality. Here, supreme power rested in the hands of the mothers. And from this single house, ruled from within, grew an idea that would one day echo through the founding of nations. As the winter deepened, the Longhouse became more than a shelter. It became a fortress of the mind. Outside, the world was white, silent, and dead, but inside, the air was full of voices. This was the time for stories. In the long dark hours, while the wind howled against the elm bark, the elders would tell of the great law of peace. They told of a time long ago when 5 nations were locked in war and the forests ran red with blood. They told of a peacemaker who traveled in a canoe of white stone, teaching the people that they were all brothers, and he used the Longhouse as his symbol. He told the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca that they were no longer separate tribes. Now they were one family, living in a single invisible Longhouse that stretched across their entire homeland. The Mohawk would guard the eastern door, the first to face the rising sun and any enemy from the sea. The Seneca would guard the western door, and the Onondaga would sit at the center, keeping the great council fire. This was not just a story to pass the time. It was the very thread that held their world together. As the children listened, nestled beneath their bare hide robes, they learned that their survival depended on the person sitting across the fire from them. The wooden Longhouse, with its overlapping bark and its tightly lashed joints, was a living lesson in unity. If one rib broke, the roof would collapse. If one sheet of bark peeled away, the cold would pour in for everyone. The house itself taught them, and the 5 nations had learned the lesson of the bending tree. They had learned to bend toward one another until 5 had become one. That night, the storm came for the house itself, and the house answered. There's a moment in the deep of a Great Lakes winter when the world seems to stop breathing. The wind rises to a high whistle, and the snow falls so thick that the forest vanishes into a wall of white. Inside the Longhouse, the people are sleeping, but the house itself is awake. In the deep dark of midnight, you can hear the building speak. It is a language of groans and small cracks. As the blizzard slams into the eastern wall, the hickory lashings stretch and tighten. The wooden ribs, those saplings so carefully bent in the spring, flex under the weight of the wind. A rigid house of stone or heavy timber might crack under this pressure, but the Longhouse is an acrobat. It bends. It leans into the storm, the scales of bark sliding gently against one another, absorbing the blow before springing back into place. And if you woke in the middle of that storm, you would see the dim glow of the fires, now only deep red embers. The air would be still, sheltered by the thick hide of the elm, and you would hear the soft, even breathing of your family on the platforms all around you, a sound more comforting than any wall. 2 forces, the killing cold of the forest and the life-giving warmth of the fire, press against each other at the edge of the bark, and for 6 long months, the bark holds the line. In the quietest corner of the Longhouse, near the clan mother's bench, were the objects that held the memory of the people. These were the wampum belts, intricate tapestries woven from purple and white shells harvested from a distant sea. In a world without paper or ink, these shells were the ink. Every pattern, every row of beads was a chapter in their history. One belt might record a peace treaty, another might tell of a great famine or the birth of the Confederacy. And in winter, the Longhouse became a school. The clan mother would draw out a belt, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool shells in the firelight, and read the stories to the young. Because there were no secrets in a Longhouse, and because there were no secrets, there was a deep, unshakable sense of belonging. As the child traced those cold shells in the glow of the embers, she understood, for the first time, that she was a link in a chain stretching back to the very beginning. And so, by the first light of spring, the child finally understood all three secrets. Return now to the child, barefoot, warm, laughing in the heart of a killing winter. Now, at last, we understand why. The first secret. How did this wooden machine defy the laws of nature? Because it never fought nature at all. It bent with it. The curved frame, the sliding scales of bark, the whole house swaying into the storm and springing back, riding the wind instead of resisting it. The second secret. How did 10 fires burn without choking anyone? Because the smoke was never the enemy. The angled vents pulled it up and out, while the warm gray layer above became a blanket of heat and a keeper of their food. The smoke was their protector. And the third secret. Why did this house become the blueprint for a democracy? Because its architecture forced them to share. Share the fire, share the wall, share the roof. And a house that forces you to share will, in time, build a people who know how to agree. The harmony of the home became the model for the harmony of an entire nation. A longhouse was built to last 20 or 30 years, but it demanded constant, loving care. Worn bark was replaced with fresh, and the old bark was never wasted, reused as windbreaks or to line the storage pits below the floor. And when at last the surrounding forest grew tired, when the firewood ran thin and the soil of the fields grew pale, the people made a remarkable choice. They did not force the land to give more than it could. They took down the longhouse, carried away their finest poles and most precious things, and left the rest for the forest. Within a few years, a new forest would rise where the village had stood. They lived by the rhythm of the earth, understanding that to live upon the land, you must sometimes let it rest. And perhaps that is the lesson the longhouse leaves for us. In our world of concrete and glass, we have forgotten this wisdom, the lost art of living in harmony with the earth instead of against it. We have sealed ourselves into separate rooms and forgotten that real warmth comes from belonging to one another. The child was laughing because she was warm, but she was warm because of everything around her. The bending frame, the skin of bark, the shared fires, the gray blanket of smoke, the 100 bodies breathing close, and the unbreakable knowledge deep in her bones that her survival lay in the person sitting across the fire. She had learned the lesson of the young tree. To survive, you must learn to bend toward each other. So here is a question for you. Could you live in a single room with 100 others and no secrets at all? Tell me in the comments below. And if you want to follow this journey further, stay close. Because next time, we travel to a place where the sun never sets, and the ground itself is made of ancient ice, to meet a people who mastered an entirely different element to survive. Until then, stay warm and stay curious.